and welcome to Security Analysis. I am Uday Bhaskar. Our subject this week is about India and its composite air power. And therefore, we would be looking at the lead institution when it comes to air power, that is the Indian Air Force. This is also the run-up to Air Force Day on October 8th. And as it happens, the Indian Air Force has a new chief, Air Chief Marshal Vivek Ram Chaudhary, who has just taken over. To discuss the profile of the Indian Air Force and the challenges that lie ahead for India in terms of nurturing its air power in the most appropriate way, I am very happy to welcome and introduce Air Marshal Raghunath Nambiar, retired. Welcome, Air Marshal Nambiar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me.
And if I may add, as his profile, you can see a very modest man. Both of us, by the way, have the same hairstyle. So people with our hairstyle are naturally modest. But if I could just add a line about Air Marshal Nambiar, he's a test pilot of great accomplishment professionally. He is recognized by his peers. He also has the distinction of having been the Air Officer Commanding in Chief, that is the AOC in C as it is referred to in the service parlance, both of the Eastern Air Command and the Western Air Command. And I recall that when we were tracking the Kargil War in 1999, he was the first pilot, if I remember right, please correct me if I'm wrong, Air Marshal Nambiar, to deliver the laser-guided ordnance in the high Himalayas, which is a very difficult task at that time, but he did it, as I said again, with his professional elan. Air Marshal Nambiar, very glad to have you with us this morning. And allow me also to greet you and through you, our air warriors in blue, as you prepare for October 8th. But my focus today is, will you help us to understand the profile of the Indian Air Force? Because it is often said that the Air Force, the Indian Air Force, is the fourth largest in the world. It also has a great track record. Going back to the first war for Kashmir, 47-48, when the Indian Air Force and the transport fleet did an enormously, I would say, commendable job. But over to you. Why don't you help us to understand, as I said, the profile of the Indian Air Force? Air Marshal Nambiar, all yours.
Thank you for having me this morning, sir. And it's a pleasure to be on this channel. The backdrop of the 8th of October, which is Air Force Day for us. The Air Force was raised in 1932 by an ordinance. And since then, since 1933, when we were actually established with aircrafts and so-called Hawaii Sipais, so to speak, we have grown to become the fourth largest air force in the world. It's been a long journey, with a lot of ups and downs, a lot of challenges, a lot of success, and a lot of glory. We have lived up to our motto, to touch the sky with glory. The Indian Air Force today is approximately about 170,000 men in uniform.
And women,
civilians.
Sir? And women?
And civilians. I mean, when I say man, I mean everybody.
Okay.
Men,
personnel, okay, I'm joking.
Absolutely, sir. And over these years, we have grown from strength to strength. We have become from an Air Force into an aerospace power today, with our fingers in almost every domain. We have risen to the challenge whenever we have been called for, be it in 1948, or in 1965, or in 1971, or in 1999, and any of the other small conflicts that have seen our country require the Indian Air Force to be in the front. We're very proud of our heritage. We are proud of our leadership. We are proud of the people who have been there in the very beginning, who have established a great Air Force, a proud Air Force. And it has in fact been a big thrill for me. I'm a second generation Air Force officer. My father was in the Air Force too. He flew the Liberators and the Canberras. And from then onwards, when I joined the Air Force, when he retired, I've had a great amount of happiness and pleasure serving the Indian Air Force, serving this nation. As we have the backdrop of the 8th of October, we look forward to many more challenges which will come about, and I'm sure we'll surmount each one of them.
No, thanks. I think, Raghu, you placed it in a very, very appropriate kind of context, and also the personal element that you are a second generation Air Force officer. But I want to pick up on this one word, challenges for the Indian Air Force, because we're also talking of India at 75. In August 2022, India is going to be celebrating its 75th anniversary of independence. And our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, has placed a lot of emphasis on Atmanirbhar. It's not that self-reliance was unheard of in previous decades, but now there is a very concerted focus by the PM, which makes all the difference. Now, when it comes to the Air Force, I'm going to flag 3 recent developments that have done the news cycle. The first, of course, is the fact that India is acquiring the Rafale fighter aircraft from France. There also has been repeated reference that the combat fleet, the fighters of the Indian Air Force, they are shrunk in terms of total numbers. The second is that India is going to enter into a private partnership for replacing the transport aircraft. I think we have spoken about the Tatas to be the lead agency in India. And the third is that when it comes to rotary wing aircraft, which are used by all the 3 services, meaning the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and also the Indian Coast Guard, India is still dependent on the foreign supplier. We do not really have any indigenous capability. So across the board, fighter aircraft, transport aircraft, helicopters, if India is still importing, what is the way ahead for meaningful Atmanirbhar, which I imagine would imply both design and manufacture? What is the current status for this? Raghu?
Thank you. This is quite an interesting question, sir, and would require a little bit of background information. In any growth of any nations, one of the most important factors in its development would be the fact that it is militarily independent. And when we gained our independence in 1947, we were where we were, with the Britishers having left us with whatever capabilities that had been developed partially for World War II, fighting that war. And we were left to swim on our own. What would naturally should have happened would be we would have to take up all the military equipment, which I would consider to be high volume, low tech first. That would involve small arms and such like parachutes or all the other boots and all the other requirements of the services to get going. And thereafter graduate from high volume, low tech to low volume, high tech. That is the sort of growth path which would normally be envisaged in any developing country's history. Unfortunately for us, our industrial base hasn't kept pace with our military requirements. We are faced with nuclear armed neighbors, both in the north and into the west, and each of them have posed some challenges to us, which have caused us to sort of jump and get into a knee-jerk reaction to counter them or to deter them. In the process, our long-term growth strategy has suffered, along with our economy, which has seen its ups and downs, and therefore our growth and our industrial progress has not been adequate. Today, when we talk about shipbuilding, or for that matter, aircraft, which is even at a higher level, or aerospace engineering, which involves high tech but low volume, we require an industrial base to support it. Unfortunately, that is lacking. What has happened in the past is that we have decided to go in for a public sector growth model, in which we devoted all our energies, resources, and monies into public sectors like, for example, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, and so on and so forth, hoping that they would progress us in this path to get to high-tech, low-volume production, because our requirements are not huge. We would require, say, about 30 fighters in a year, and that's about it. But to have that sort of 30 fighter production, the sort of equipment which requires to be industrially available within the nation is inadequate. And therefore, we tend to import them. Even today, when we talk of the light combat aircraft, I understand from the CAG report that only about 60% of the aircraft is still imported. Even the metal comes from abroad. Even the engine comes from abroad. The ejection seat is from abroad. The guns are from abroad. Some of the weapon systems on board are from abroad. I mean, essentially, what we are doing is integration. We are taking equipment from abroad, putting it together and calling it Indian. I don't think that is the way to go about it. We have to have a holistic means of trying to develop in every facet of aerospace to make sure that we are Atmanirbhar in the true sense of the word. As regards you mentioned about the model which we have now sort of made a inroad into, which is the private partnership model, in which we have signed up with Airbus Industries to procure 56 aircraft to replace our old Avros, which have been flying since the 1960s. The Avro, if you recollect, was first manufactured by the Indian Air Force and not HAL in Kanpur. And thereafter, the aircraft factory of the Indian Air Force was handed over to HAL, and HAL started producing the Avro from the 1960s. This is a licensed manufacturer. And this is exactly the model which we are following so many years later, which is I would say a bit ironic. But unfortunately, that is the way we don't have much choices. And but the only difference being, from a public sector undertaking, we have now decided to go with a private sector venture. In the next 10 years, we expect these 56 aircraft to be produced. The last of these 56, the 40 of them being made in India, the last of the 56 will have probably about 18,000 components made in India, actually made in India. But the fact still remains that since we have only 56 aircraft, the engines will still continue to be imported, as would be many of the important facets like undercarriages and such like. And that's the way it is.
You very briefly, Raghu, here, just to add, I think this is a very important observation that you made, and I'm flagging this for the benefit of our younger viewers, that the Indian Air Force, after independence, actually had a remarkable accomplishment professionally. One is the Avro, which, as you said, the credit is to the Indian Air Force. The second was the fighter, the Marut, the HF-24, which again, even if it was done jointly, if you remember the German designer who had provided the necessary, I would say, software and design assistance, was also a success story in its nascent first, variant of that particular platform. Now, many years ago, I remember I had attended a conference, as it happens in Germany, and we were talking about India and its indigenization effort. And one of the German civilians from the aeronautical industry, he drew attention to this fact and said that actually what India did with the Marut had stunned all of us professionally. We did not expect that a country that had just come out of the colonial period, and where the image of India was something which was very different. It was an impoverished country, it could not feed its people, etc., etc. And that you had the success story of the Marut. But unfortunately, this was not sustained. And this is where I want to ask you a question specific to the Indian Air Force. You spoke about shipbuilding and what the Navy had done. To put it very briefly, if the Navy has had some success in indigenization, particularly as far as warship design is concerned, and subsequently production in Mazagon docks and the other yards in Kolkata and Goa, etc., Vishakhapatnam, I would say as an analyst that one of the reasons is that the Indian Navy at an early stage invested in HR, which is service officers, people in white, were trained as naval architects. They trained in India, some went abroad, and we created a whole directorate. My reading is very broadly that it helped in a way to lay a foundation. And then the Indian Navy took ownership of the public sector shipyards, meaning officers at admiral rank 2-star, 3-star were seconded, and they became the CMDs of the shipyard. We've also had a mixed bag. I'm not saying everything was a success. We made some progress. We could have done better in other areas. So my specific question to you, you've been an AOC in C of 2 commands. I'm sure you at senior level would have been discussing this in the commanders conference. Did the Air Force ever consider investing in aircraft design and train its own officers as a cadre and encourage them to be part both of public sector and maybe energize the private sector? Was this ever considered, and did it not fly for whatever reasons that the Indian Air Force would be aware of? Raghu?
So being a test pilot, I've had an opportunity to work very closely with aircraft designers from the civil sector, be it from the National Aerospace Laboratory or from the Aeronautics Development Establishment or Aeronautic Development Agencies. Let me tell you, sir, it is not as simple as ship design is. This is advanced, high-tech. If it was so easy, I'm sure naval officers would start making ships, not only ships, they would make aircrafts also. There are naval aircrafts which are also required, but I'm sure that's not the way the Navy would like to go, because they are cutting-edge technologies which require focused attention, devoid of any distraction from any other naval chores. You have to look at aircraft design as a single entity, and you have to be like Arjuna, focused on the eye of the fish.
Absolutely.
That is something which is not possible when you are in uniform. We have our growth path charted out for us. We have to do sea time, we have to do flying time, we have to do command, we have to do so many responsibilities. Getting deviated from it by getting into design of an aircraft is rocket science. And I would suggest that this is not the way we have to go. We would have to, in this particular domain, have some sort of silos where we reserve this for people who are full-time into aviation design rather than part-time looking at it as some sort of a amateur hobby type of environment. So therefore, it is not as simple as it sounds. Otherwise, the Indian Navy would be making helicopters, and they would not only making helicopters, they would be making probably fighters for the Vikram and the Vikramaditya and all the other aircraft carriers that we have. Obviously, there is some challenge there, which is difficult to sort of surmount. Given that, I'm sure the Navy has done wonders. But I would put to you, sir, that despite the ships being in the second tier of our growth path, I mean, much below the fact that we are looking at aerospace engineering, which is the ultimate tip of the iceberg, so to speak, you still have our ships with a lot of components which are imported. Let me give you an example. So INS Kolkata is what we're being talked about. I had the chance to look at INS Kolkata in a little bit of detail from the point of view of how much of it is imported. And I was surprised to see almost 60% of the INS Kolkata is imported by cost terms.
All the
by weight terms, I am sure it is, by weight terms, I'm sure it is Indian, mostly Indian. But if you look at the value terms.
Brief point, please don't get me wrong. I'm not making this as a Navy versus Air Force. Far from it. So, I am the first to accept, I've written about this, that even if the Indian Navy talks about indigenization as a success story, the reality is that our guns come from abroad.
Exactly.
Engines, radar, surveillance, so fire control, all of this is still imported. We have a lot to do before we can say that we are meaningfully Atmanirbhar. Yeah. My question is of a different, I would say the frame is different. Let me rephrase it. All I'm saying is that if India wants to acquire some degree of self-reliance, Atmanirbharta, which is the word, even in aircraft design or aerospace, an engine like the Kaveri, for instance, I am saying the country has to invest in HR, whether it is done through the Air Force or it is done through the civilian side. After all, we did have a success story in space. So, we have a success story in India and the missile program, India and nuclear weapons. So that is the point I'm getting at. The way ahead, that's my query to you. And my request is, what is the way ahead for India to look at this very complex, cutting edge technology for aerospace?
My point, sir, is this, and what I would like to emphasize is, first we have to get our economy to grow. There is but no choice in the matter. Short-term requirements have to be fulfilled probably by importing, but we have to have a long-term view towards getting into Atmanirbharta. Atmanirbharta is not a knee-jerk reaction or a sloganing contest. What we have to do is to first set up an industrial base which can support our Atmanirbharta program. We have to get into the component levels of things to make sure that we have an equipment or we have a fully indigenous product. Indigenous product should have the capability of being maintained within India with very little resources. In fact, the downtime for an indigenous product should be far lower than what is abroad.
Correct.
Obviously, we have to set up a supply chain in place, which will make sure that an indigenous product is useful to us.
Correct.
It's faster to replace, it's faster, it's more economical to replace, and it gets us and makes us win the war. Our way of working today has been knee-jerk. When we have our enemies do or our threats doing something, we react to it with a new or another weapon system as a knee-jerk reaction to make sure that our immediate operational requirements are fulfilled. And we then look at what are leftover resources to devote it towards Atmanirbharta. That is what has been happening over the years. And these low-hanging fruit that we have been grabbing has resulted in us being where we are today. Even today, most of us will be surprised to know that small arms, which is the most lowest rung in our development path as far as the military is concerned, in terms of being very high volume and relatively low tech as compared to anything else, still continues to be imported. We are today talking of the army buying about 140,000 6 or 716 rifles. We are talking of the army buying the AK-203 latest variant of the what is it?
Not to worry, not to worry.
Just a second, so may I just put...
No problem. No problem.
Sorry, sir.
No, you just pick up from here, talk about the small arms at the Indian Army and 140,000 voting.
Yes, sir. We have purchased 140,000 6 or 716 rifles from the United States of America. We are in the process of establishing a factory for making the AK-203 rifle. 670,000 are going to be made at Amethi. Even in the lowest rung of our development path for the military, we are still importing, so to speak. And therefore, I think we have to have a long-term focus on what we want to do. Our immediate operational requirement for the soldiers required some capabilities in the front line, and therefore we went in for some sort of purchases. And subsequent to that, we have to look at what we are going to do 20 years from now, and set about setting the infrastructure up or the capability and the design up today to make a good that particular aim. Unfortunately, that has been probably deficient.
You know, I think I'm going to underline two of the points that you have made, which I think are very important. One is sloganeering. I think regrettably, much of the Prime Minister's very earnest effort at Atmanirbharta is sometimes carried into rhetoric that is devoid of substance. Meaning, and here I just want to draw attention to our media. I was a bit, I would say, both surprised, maybe I shouldn't say surprised, but definitely dismayed, that even something like the transport aircraft and the decision to enter into a private partnership with Aerobus and to replace the Avro was flashed as, you know, a major step in Atmanirbharta, which is not the truth. You know, if you are getting an aircraft from abroad and introducing it into the private sector partnership, it is not the same as meaningful indigenization. But as you said, unfortunately, you know, we get carried away in our own rhetoric and sloganeering. And this perhaps is also illustrated in the fact that, as you rightly said, even something as rudimentary as a personal weapon, not only for the Indian Army or the Indian military, but also for the Indian police and our central armed police, the CAPF, they also need. And we are a very large country with almost 2 million plus in uniform who need the personal weapon. And yet we are dependent either on the US or, in the case of the AK, from Moscow for basic design. So I think these are areas that need very concerted national attention, and I hope that they would be sort of acknowledged by our policymakers. But let me look 20 years ahead, Raghu. In the last section of our chat, I'm going to request you to really share your thoughts, because I know you've written about this subject and I think your views would be very useful. If we look at 20 years from now, and at 2040 as India at 95, India at 96. Aerospace power is going to be critical for India's comprehensive national power, comprehensive military power. What I'm going to request you, Marshal Nambiar, is to really pick up this one point you made about 20 years ahead, that India or any country has to look 20 years ahead. If we talk about 2042, which is India at 95, aerospace power is going to be a very important adjunct of comprehensive, not only national power, comprehensive military power. Now, we are aware that the country is going through a very major transformation of higher defense, and theater commands have been spoken about. I know that you have spoken, you have written about the unity of air power as one of the concepts that needs to be acknowledged or recognized, and India's constraints that our assets are limited. So in the light of that, what do you see as the way ahead to nurture air power and to also provide a certain fillip to aerospace power? Because my sense is that in the future, it's not just the fighter jock, if I could use that phrase, test pilots like you in the cockpit, but we are going to be looking at space as a very, I would say, important domain for any country which is in the league that India is. Raghu?
My views on theater command are well known. Let me just sort of rephrase what I think on the subject. I think theater command is a good idea, provided we have resources. Look at what theater command intends to do as far as the Navy is concerned. From what is available in the open domain and which has been discussed threadbare in the press, what is very clear is what the thought process of our military leadership is to consolidate all the three wings of the Navy. That is the Southern Command, the resources of Southern Command, the resources of Western Fleet, the resources of the Eastern Fleet combined together into a maritime theater command. This is true consolidation. You now have one Navy which is operating under one head who can decide how he wants to fight with all the resources of the Navy available to him. Compare this with what is the thought process for the Indian Air Force. What is envisaged, as I see it today, is to split the Air Force into the other theaters. To my mind, they're talking about, obviously the maritime theater would have a component of the Air Force with it. Some of the component of the Air Force would be the Eastern Theater Command, some with the Northern Theater Command, some with the Western Theater Command, and some with the Air Defense Command. Essentially, what have you done? You intend to split the Air Force into 5 or 6 parts and then assume that the Air Force will be able to function in a better manner than what it is doing today. I think that's a fallacy, and I think that is something which we have to really ponder about. Does splitting well-knit flying force into multiple sections, primarily because it's not that the Air Force is not split up today, but there is a unity of command in the sense that despite all this splitting up, Air Force can be ordered as existing today by one air chief to do exactly what he would want or he would think it to be the right way to progress in a particular situation, be it in war or in peace. The resources are allocated all over. Air power is so critical that it's important that it be available to everybody. To do that, ideally, if there is no shortage, would be to give each of these theaters an individual Air Force to fight with and to operate in peace. Unfortunately, we do not have that privilege. We are in a year of shortages. In 2002, the Indian Air Force consisted of 42 combat fighter aircraft fleets. Today, unfortunately, we are down to 30. And if, including all the Rafales which are going to come in, the light combat aircraft, various marks which will come in, we will still keep declining down to 27 in the next 5 years and down to 19 in the next 10 years. We do not yet have a process in place which would ensure that the Indian Air Force would stabilize at 30. And that is the tragedy. To my mind, I think you, sir, are talking of the next 20 years. Sir, I'm telling you about what is going to happen in the next 10 years. We are going to decline. And if you now split the Indian Air Force into 5 or 6 parts and assume that you will be a better fighting force, I think there is something wrong in our thought process.
I must thank you.
Consolidation is essential.
Yeah. No, I'm saying I must thank you. What you have outlined is not only stark, it's also very lucid. And I think you have conveyed it in a manner that even the lay person would be able to comprehend. But in the run up to Air Force Day, we should give the last word to a man in blue. So I'm not going to give you an alternate view about theater commands and the use of air power. Let that be for another conversation. But I do want to thank you, Air Marshal Nambiar, for sharing your thoughts in a very candid, very lucid, and very persuasive manner. I think what you have said about the profile of the Indian Air Force in the next 10 years is something that I'm sure our policymakers would be cogitating over as they plan for India, not only at 75, but India at 80 and onwards. But again, thank you very much. And I hope that we'll be able to invite you very soon to have a more detailed chat about India and the way ahead as far as space is concerned.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for watching Security Analysis, and we will be back again with another subject next week. Jai Hind.